There's a number that has been sitting in the back of my mind for months now, and I keep coming back to it because of what it actually means in practice. 240 million. That is the estimated number of computers that Microsoft declared not good enough for Windows 11. Not broken computers, not slow computers, machines that people had been using every single day, without a single complaint, running spreadsheets, browsing the web, watching videos, doing real work. And on October 14th, 2025, Microsoft walked away from all of them. No more security patches, no more fixes, no more support. Done. I want you to think about what that actually looks like from inside your house. Your computer still starts up. Your files are still there. Nothing has physically changed. But from that date forward, every unpatched vulnerability that gets discovered in Windows 10 is a door left permanently open, and Microsoft has no intention of closing it. They did offer a lifeline, a paid extended security updates program at around $30 per year for home users, but that only buys you 12 more months. Before the price increases again, you are essentially paying Microsoft on a recurring subscription to keep supporting an operating system you already paid for once. That arrangement has a word for it, and it is not a nice one. So here's the thing. I went looking for the real numbers after the cutoff hit, because I wanted to understand the scale of what we were actually talking about. StatCounter data from mid-2025 showed desktop Linux sitting at around 4% globally, with pockets of over 5% in the United States. Those numbers sound small until you layer on what happened next. Zorin OS, a Linux distribution specifically built to look and feel familiar to Windows users, reported roughly 100,000 downloads in just over 2 days in the immediate aftermath of October 14th, 2025. Valve's Steam platform crossed the 3% Linux barrier for the first time in recorded history that same month. And Zorin Group later reported over 1 million total downloads in roughly 2 months following the cutoff. That is not a coincidence. That is a pressure. Valve releasing. And yet, despite all of that, despite the deadline, the data, the download numbers, the entire migration conversation happening in every tech forum and comment section in the world right now, the overwhelming majority of those 240 million people are still sitting on unpatched Windows 10. Not because they do not know about Linux, not because they have not thought about switching. Because the process of actually trying Linux, really trying it in a way that tells you whether it works for your specific machine, your specific hardware, your specific situation, is still broken for most people. And it has been broken in the exact same way for 20 years. Here is what that broken process looks like. You do some research. You pick a distribution, probably Linux Mint, because every beginner guide on the internet points you there. You download the ISO file, which is the disk image for the operating system. You find a tool to put it on a USB drive. You go through the process of flashing that drive, which formats it completely, erasing everything on it, and writes the Linux installer. You reboot your computer, you boot from the USB, and you spend 20 minutes with the operating system. Maybe it works perfectly. Maybe your Wi-Fi does not connect because the driver for your specific wireless card is not included. Maybe the display resolution looks wrong, but maybe the file manager just feels too foreign. So you decide, maybe this is not the right distribution for me. And here is where the process breaks. To try the next one, you have to go back to your computer, download a second ISO, flash the USB drive again, formatting and overwriting the whole thing, reboot, and start over. Every single attempt at finding the right Linux distribution costs you a complete USB reformat cycle. Nobody has that kind of patience. I certainly did not the first few times I went through it. You try one distribution, maybe two if you are determined, and then the friction wins and you go back to what you know. This is not a failure of Linux. This is a failure of the tooling around how people discover Linux. And it has been silently killing Linux adoption for decades, while every conversation about market share focuses on drivers and software compatibility in the learning curve, without ever addressing the fact that the Onramp itself is structurally hostile to newcomers. There's a tool that fixes this specific problem. Not the driver problem, not the software compatibility problem, not the learning curve problem, the Onramp problem. The one that stops most people before they ever get far enough to encounter any of the others. And the fact that it has been available for over 6 years, has over 77,000 stars on GitHub, and most Windows users have never heard of it, is one of the more interesting stories in the tech world right now. The tool is called Ventoy. And what it does to the USB boot process is genuinely the kind of thing that makes you wonder why nobody built it sooner. Let me tell you exactly what Ventoy does, because once you understand the mechanism, the elegance of it is almost frustrating. Frustrating because the problem it solves should never have existed this long, and the solution is so clean that you wonder why every USB tool before it missed. Balena Etcher, the old unit booting, even the dd command on Linux itself, all of them operate on the same foundational assumption. They take an ISO file, which is a complete disk image of an operating system, and they extract and write its contents across the entire USB drive. The drive gets partitioned, formatted, and structured specifically for that one operating system. Everything else on the drive is gone. The drive is now the operating system and nothing else. Want to try a second distribution? Start over, reformat, write again. Every tool, every workflow, the same dead end. What Hailong Sun, a Chinese developer who goes by the username Long Panda on GitHub, recognized when he sat down and built Ventoy in early 2020 was that this assumption was completely unnecessary. An ISO file is just a file. It sits on a file system like any other file. There is no fundamental technical reason it needs to be extracted and written raw across an entire drive. If you could build a bootloader intelligent enough to read ISO files directly from a standard file system partition, you could store as many of them as your drive had space for, and boot any of them on demand from a menu. That is literally all Ventoy does. And that insight, that single architectural decision, changes the entire experience of trying Linux. Here is the installation process. You download Ventoy from ventoy.net. The installer package is around 17 megabytes. You run it, select your USB drive from a button, drop down, and click install. Ventoy formats the drive once, creating two partitions. A small boot partition that holds the Ventoy bootloader and a large data partition that takes up the rest of the drive. This is the only time you will ever format that drive again. From that point forward, you never touch the installer again. You open the data partition in your file, explore exactly the way you would open any external drive, and you copy ISO files onto it. Drag and drop. No burning, no writing, no waiting for a flash process to complete. You're literally just copying files. When you boot from that USB on any computer, Ventoy intercepts the boot process, reads the data partition, finds every ISO file on it, and presents you with a clean menu. You pick one. It boots. You try it for however long you want. You reboot. You pick the next one. The USB still functions as a regular storage drive for your own files at the same time, sitting alongside the ISO files in the same partition. As of the latest release, version 1.1.16, which dropped on June 25th, 2026, Ventoy has been tested against over 1,400 operating system images. 1,400. That is not a rounding error, and it is not marketing copy. That is the actual compatibility list maintained on the Ventoy project page, covering Linux distributions, Windows, WinPE, recovery environments, BSD variants, VMware installers, and more. The hardware support is equally broad. Legacy BIOS systems, 32-bit UEFI, 64-bit UEFI, ARM64, UEFI, MIPS 64EL UEFI. The April 5th, 2226 release was specifically the 6-year anniversary version, a milestone that matters because open source projects often die well before they reach that point, especially solo developer projects. Ventoy has not only survived 6 years, it has accelerated. The GitHub numbers tell a story on their own. 77. 1,000 stars on a single open source repository is a number that demands context. For reference, that places Ventoy among hand streaming software running on the machines of most of the content creators you watch. More than Redis, which powers the back-end caching infrastructure of some of the largest websites in the world. A tool built by one person, solving a problem that every major technology company had simply accepted as normal, sitting in the company of foundational infrastructure, software that entire industries depend on. The SourceForge download page shows the last update was June 25th, 2026. The project is not resting. And version 1.1.16 is not a trivial patch release either. The update cycle over the past few months pulled immediately after publication due to a packaging error, and 1.1.14 and 1.1.15 following in rapid succession before 1.1.16 landed as the stable build. The primary driver behind this sprint was Microsoft's mandatory secure boot certificate, rotation. Microsoft announced back in early 2024 that secure boot keys issued in 2011 were approaching their 15-year expiration in 2026, and new 2023 certificates would be rolling out with Windows 11 updates. Those updated certificates are mandatory. They are not optional. And if your boot tools were signed against the old certificate chain, they would stop working on systems that had received the new certificates. Ventoy had to respond to this, and it did, shipping a new secure boot CA starting with version 1.1.14, alongside a new certificate enrollment step that users need to complete on first boot after upgrading. That is a level of responsiveness from a project of this size that you do not always see, and it matters because it means the tool is being maintained for the environment you're actually living in today, not the environment that existed when the project launched. One more thing I want to mention in this section because it only just appeared and most people have not heard about it yet. The same developer behind Ventoy has been building a companion tool called iVentoy. Where Ventoy gives you a multi-boot USB drive you carry in your pocket, iVentoy turns any computer, including a Raspberry Pi, into a Network PXE boot server. You drop ISO, files into a folder, start the service, and any machine on your local network can boot directly from those images over the LAN, without touching a USB drive at all. The latest iVentoy release, version 1.0.37, landed on June 30th, 2026, just weeks ago. This is the same developer, the same philosophy, drag and drop ISO files instead of complex configuration, extended into an entirely different deployment scenario. For IT administrators managing multiple machines, this changes the workflow completely. For the average person, it is a glimpse into how far this project has grown from a single USB utility into something considerably larger. I want to be completely straight with you about something because I think you deserve the full picture before you put any tool on your system, especially one that operates at the bootloader level, which is about as deep into your hardware as software gets. There is a conversation that has been running in the open source community around Ventoy for years, and it is not fully resolved, and pretending it does not exist would be doing you a disservice. Open source software carries a specific promise. The promise is not just that the software is free. The promise is that you can read every line of code, verify exactly what it does, reproduce the compiled binary from the source yourself, and trust what you are running because you can inspect it independently. That promise is the entire foundation of why security-conscious users choose open source tools in the first place. It is why Linux exists as an alternative to Windows, rather than just another black box operating system. For years, parts of Ventoy contained binary blobs, precompiled pieces of the bootloader that were included in the released builds, but whose source code was either absent or could not be cleanly reproduced by following the provided build instructions. This is not a theoretical problem. A bootloader runs before your operating system. It runs before your antivirus. It runs before anything you have installed to protect yourself. If something is happening in that layer that you open source community flag this seriously and repeatedly. Some Linux distributions decline to officially recommend Ventoy because of it. Security-focused users flagged it as a risk. The Wikipedia article for Ventoy still carries an accuracy notice and describes the project as partially open source rather than fully open source, a classification that reflects this unresolved tension. Long Panda responded by documenting the binary components and publishing build instructions, but critics noted that those instructions were difficult to reproduce cleanly in practice. The conversation has moved, but it is not concluded. Here is my honest position on this, having spent real time reading through the community discussions, the GitHub, issue threads, and the independent security analyses. For the average person coming from Windows 10, whose goal is to try several Linux distributions to find one that works for their machine, the practical risk from Ventoy's binary components is low. The project has been downloaded tens of millions of times. It has been examined by thousands of developers across 6 years. No actual malicious behavior has been documented. The GitHub repository remains actively maintained with no credible security flags raised in recent months. The June 2026 release sprint, responding to Microsoft's mandatory secure boot certificate changes, reflects a project that is tracking the real security environment and responding to it correctly. These are not the patterns of an abandoned or compromised tool. But low risk is not zero risk, and I will not tell you it is. What I will tell you is that transparency matters. You now know the full picture, and you can make your own informed decision. That is exactly what Linux is supposed to be about. Your machine, your choice, your call. Now let me shift to the part of this conversation that I think is actually the most underreported piece of the entire Linux migration story in 2026, because it is not about the tools themselves. It is about why the tools matter for a very specific kind of person, and why Ventoy in particular addresses something that nobody in the mainstream tech press has bothered to name clearly. When I look at who is actually being displaced by Windows 10 going end of life, it is not 25-year-old developers. Those people upgraded to Windows 11, or they were already on Linux anyway. The people sitting on those 240 million end-of-life machines, skew older. People who have been using Windows since the 90s. People who know their way around a computer perfectly well, who are not intimidated by technology, but who also are not interested in spending their weekends debugging driver conflicts or reading forum threads about kernel modules. People who want something that works. And for decades, Windows was that thing. Not because Windows was technically superior, but because it was familiar and it was there and nothing about switching felt worth the disruption. What changed on October 14th, 2025 was been on Windows for 30 years, approaches the idea of switching. But here is where the psychology gets interesting and where Ventoy slots in a way that nothing else does. The biggest thing stopping that person from switching is not the learning curve of a new operating system. It is the fear of choosing wrong. Linux Mint looks different from Zorin OS. Zorin OS feels different from Ubuntu. Ubuntu behaves differently from Fedora. Pop! OS has a different approach to package management than everything else on the list. And every article recommending Linux distributions disagrees with every other article. If you have to pick one, commit to reformatting a USB drive for it and discover that it does not work perfectly with your hardware. The experience feels like a dead end. You tried Linux, it did not work. That is the conclusion most people reach. Not because Linux failed them, but because the process of finding the right distribution failed them before they got far enough to make a fair evaluation. Ventoy turns that dead end into a menu. You load 8 distributions onto one USB drive over the course of an afternoon. You boot the first one. Your Wi-Fi connects. Your display looks right. Everything feels responsive. Or it does not, and you reboot and try the next one. Your Windows installation is sitting completely untouched on your hard drive the entire time. Nothing is being installed. Nothing is being changed. You are test driving operating systems the way you would test drive cars, without signing anything, without committing, without risk. And the moment you find the one that feels right, that moment when everything just works and you think, wait, this is actually fine, that is when the entire mental barrier around switching collapses. That moment does not happen if you have to reformat a USB drive between every attempt. That is not a small logistical complaint. That is the difference between someone finding their escape route from an abandoned operating system and someone giving up and staying exposed. So let me give you the practical side of this, because everything I have covered so far means nothing if you walk away without a clear path forward. I have spent time with this workflow personally, and I want to walk you through exactly what I would put on a Ventoy USB drive today in July 2026 for someone coming off Windows 10 who wants to find their permanent home on Linux without gambling on a single distribution and hoping for the best. First, the hardware. You want a USB drive with at least 32 gigabytes of space. A 64 gigabyte drive is better and costs almost nothing at this point. Ventoy's own installer is around 17 megabytes. The data partition that holds your ISO files takes up everything else. A typical Linux distribution ISO runs between 2 and 4 gigabytes, which means a 64 gigabyte drive comfortably holds 12 to 15 distributions simultaneously, with room left over for your own files sitting right alongside them on the same drive. You do not need a high-speed drive for this. A standard USB 3.0 drive from any brand works fine. The boot process reads sequentially, not randomly, so raw transfer speed matters less than you might expect. The installation itself takes under 2 minutes. You download Ventoy 1.1.16 from ventoy.net, the current stable release, as of June 25th, 2026. You run the installer, select your drive, click install, confirm the format warning, and it is done. Everything after that point is just file copying. Now let me tell you what I would actually put on that drive, and why each choice is deliberate rather than just a greatest hits list. Zorin OS 17 goes on first. Not because it is the most powerful or the most technically interesting distribution, but because if you have been on Windows for 20 or 30 years, Zorin OS is the distribution that will make you feel least like you have made a mistake. The taskbar is in the right place. The start menu equivalent looks familiar. The file manager behaves the way you expect. The visual shock of switching operating systems is almost entirely absent. For a lot of people, Zorin OS is the one that produces that moment I described at the end of the last section, where you think, wait, this is actually fine. That moment matters more than any benchmark. Linux Mint with the Cinnamon desktop goes on second. Linux Mint has been the most recommended distribution for Windows switchers for nearly a decade, and that reputation is earned. The hardware compatibility is excellent across a very wide range of machines. The update manager is conservative, which means your system stays stable rather than chasing the bleeding edge. The community around Linux Mint is enormous, which means if something does not work, the answer to your specific problem almost certainly already exists somewhere in a forum thread. If Zorin OS does not click for you, Linux Mint is frequently the one that does. Ubuntu 24.04 LTS goes on third. Not because it is the most beginner-friendly option on this list, it is not, but because it has the broadest raw hardware driver support of any distribution available. Right now, if your Wi-Fi adapter is obscure, if your printer is old, if something in your hardware configuration is unusual, Ubuntu is statistically the most likely distribution to handle it without manual intervention. The LTS designation means long-term support, with security updates guaranteed through 2029. You're not inheriting another end-of-life countdown the moment you install it. POP OS 22-04 goes on as your fourth slot, specifically if you have an NVIDIA graphics card. System 76 built POP OS, and they have put serious work into NVIDIA driver integration in a way that most distributions handle poorly. If you have ever tried Linux before and the display behaved strangely or the graphics performance felt wrong, there is a reasonable chance the NVIDIA driver situation was responsible. POP OS largely solves that specific problem out of the box. And then one more, Fedora 40. I include Fedora not because it is the easiest starting point. It runs a slightly more cutting-edge package base than the others, which means occasionally things move faster than you expect, but because it represents a genuinely different philosophy about how a Linux system is maintained and updated. Trying it costs you nothing when it is already sitting on your Ventoy drive. And some people who bounce off Mint and Zorn OS find that Fedora's approach actually suits them better. You will not know until you try it. And with Ventoy, trying it is just a reboot away. That is 5 distributions, 5 operating systems, 5 complete, fully functional, completely free alternatives to an abandoned Microsoft product, all on one USB drive you built in an afternoon. Your Windows installation untouched, your files safe, zero commitment, zero risk, zero cost beyond a USB drive you probably already own. Now here's the part that matters beyond the technical details. There's a developer named Hailong Sun who released the first version of Ventoy on April 5th, 2020, alone, without corporate backing, without venture capital, without a team. 6 years and 16 major point releases later, the project just pushed version 1.1.16 3 weeks ago, responding to a mandatory Microsoft security certificate change that would have broken boot compatibility across millions of systems if left unaddressed. That kind of sustained responsive maintenance from a solo open source developer is genuinely rare, and it deserves to be recognized as exactly what it is. Someone who saw a problem that an entire industry had accepted as permanent and fixed it anyway. 240 million machines got abandoned on October 14th, 2025. Microsoft's answer was to sell you new hardware. Hailong Sun's answer was already sitting on GitHub 4 years before the deadline even hit. Free, open source, 17 megabytes, and it just needs a USB drive. If this video gave you something useful, something you are going to actually act on, subscribe. Not for the algorithm, though that matters too. Subscribe, because what? Ventoy.net, download version 1.1.16. Grab a 32 or 64 gigabyte USB drive. Have it ready. Your escape route from Windows is 17 megabytes and one USB stick away. Microsoft did not plan for that, but somebody did.